If you've ever been told you're too sensitive, that you cry too easily, or that you need to toughen up, pause for a moment. What I'm about to share with you may completely change how you see yourself. In my clinical work, I've noticed something very important. The people who are most ashamed of their tears are often the ones who feel the deepest. And yet, they've been taught to believe that this is a flaw. Before I explain why highly sensitive people are not weak, but emotionally powerful, I need you to understand something essential about your brain and your nervous system. Because by the end of this video, you're going to learn a scientific truth that many people live their entire lives without ever hearing. And that truth can quietly transform how you relate to yourself. If something inside you feels recognized right now, please stay. This conversation may be arriving exactly when you need it. We live in a culture that has sold us a dangerous lie, a lie that tells us intense emotions are a problem, that crying means weakness, that feeling deeply makes you fragile, unstable, or incapable of handling life. Every week in my consultation room, I see the consequences of that belief. Brilliant, kind, deeply empathetic people sit across from me convinced that something is wrong with them, simply because they feel too much. They've spent years swallowing emotions, forcing themselves to be strong, only to arrive emotionally exhausted, anxious, or physically unwell. And here is the uncomfortable truth no one warns you about. That belief is not only wrong, it is scientifically backwards. When you cry easily, your brain is not malfunctioning. It is doing something remarkably sophisticated. Tears are not a system error. They are a regulation mechanism. Your nervous system processes the world in a uniquely deep way. When something moves you, sadness, beauty, injustice, someone else's pain, your brain doesn't just register it. It absorbs it fully. It captures emotional nuance, subtle meaning, and human complexity that others often miss. And your body responds with honesty. That honesty shows up as tears. I've watched this pattern repeat for years. Someone comes to therapy after a lifetime of holding it together, being the strong one, the one who never complains. And then their body begins to speak. Chronic tension, digestive issues, insomnia, anxiety, unexplained pain, and when they finally allow themselves to cry, really cry, it's as if their entire system exhales. Because your mind and body are not separate. They are one integrated system. When you suppress tears, you're not eliminating emotion, you're burying it. And buried emotions don't disappear. They resurface as symptoms, as illness, as silent suffering. If you're thinking about the times you felt embarrassed for crying, at work, in front of family, with a partner, hear me clearly. Those moments don't mean you are broken. They mean we live in a society that still does not understand emotional intelligence. And now, I want to show you what is actually happening inside your body when you cry. Because this is where the science becomes truly fascinating. Let me explain what is actually happening inside your body when you cry, because this is where many people finally stop blaming themselves. In my consultations, I often hear patients say, "I don't understand why I cry so easily. Nothing is even that wrong." And what most people don't realize is that crying is not a failure of control. It is a biological release. When you experience emotional stress, your body produces cortisol. Cortisol is the primary stress hormone. It rises when you feel overwhelmed, pressured, unsafe, or emotionally overloaded. And here is something fascinating. Emotional tears are chemically different from reflex tears, like when something gets in your eye. Emotional tears actually contain cortisol and other stress byproducts. So when you cry, your body is not falling apart. It is detoxifying. It is literally releasing stress through a physical outlet. Think of it as an emotional drainage system, and people who cry easily tend to have that system working very efficiently. That's why after crying, you often feel calmer, lighter, more grounded. That relief isn't imagined. Your nervous system has shifted out of survival mode. Highly sensitive people tend to have a nervous system that reacts quickly and deeply. Their limbic system, which processes emotions, is highly responsive. But here's the part that rarely gets talked about. In sensitive individuals, the emotional centers of the brain are often more connected to the prefrontal cortex, the area responsible for empathy, insight, and meaning-making. In other words, these brains don't just feel more, they integrate more. This is why sensitive people are often deeply intuitive. They read emotional subtext. They sense tension before words are spoken. They notice subtle shifts in tone, posture, energy. Their brains are constantly processing layers that others overlook. And yes, that means they are more affected by emotional content. A movie that feels a bit sad to someone else can feel overwhelming to you. Not because you're dramatic, but because your brain is absorbing the full emotional complexity of the story. I once worked with a patient who felt ashamed because she cried at almost everything. Films, songs, videos of animals being rescued. She told me her partner joked that she cried on purpose. She had even gone to a doctor, worried there was something hormonally wrong with her. What we uncovered was simple and profound. She worked in an emotionally cold, high-pressure environment where showing any feeling was punished. For 8 hours a day, she wore a mask. No reaction to injustice, no visible joy, no frustration. Everything held in. When she got home and finally felt safe, her nervous system released everything it had been carrying. The tears weren't weakness. They were survival. Once she learned to express small emotions throughout the day, naming discomfort, allowing brief moments of honesty, the intense emotional flooding at night softened. Her sensitivity didn't disappear. It became regulated. And this leads to something crucial. Sensitivity is not random. It is not a flaw. It is an evolutionary adaptation. In early human communities, the individuals who sensed danger early, who noticed emotional shifts in the group, who responded to distress quickly, those were essential for survival. We still need those people. The problem is not your sensitivity. The problem is living in a world that moves too fast, numbs emotion, and demands constant toughness. And you are not meant to become less sensitive to survive. You are meant to learn how to live sensitively without harming yourself. That distinction changes everything. Now I want to gently dismantle some of the most damaging myths surrounding crying and emotional sensitivity. Because every time you believe one of them, an inner voice forms that judges you, shames you, and makes you feel smaller than you are. And I see the damage of these myths every single day. The first myth is that crying means weakness. This one is especially toxic. In over 20 years of clinical work, I've observed something very consistent. The people who pride themselves on never crying, on being tough, on not letting anything affect them, those are often the ones who collapse the hardest. I've seen highly successful professionals develop panic disorders seemingly overnight. I've seen people who never allowed themselves to grieve fall into addiction. I've seen chronic emotional suppression manifest as autoimmune disease, cardiovascular issues, and severe burnout. Here's the truth no one tells you. Repression is not strength. It's a loan you take out against your body, and eventually, the body collects with interest. Unprocessed emotions do not disappear. They transform. And what they transform into is often far more destructive than tears. The second myth is that if you cry easily, you lack emotional control. This is the opposite of reality. Crying is emotional regulation. It is your nervous system processing and releasing. True emotional dysregulation is exploding in rage because sadness was never allowed. It's chronic anxiety because fear was never acknowledged. Tears are not loss of control. They are control in action. The third myth is that sensitive people can't handle hardship. This one angers me deeply. Sensitive people are often the most resilient individuals I know. Why? Because they have access to their full emotional range. They feel pain deeply, but they also feel meaning, hope, love, and beauty deeply. I have worked with trauma survivors, people who have lost everything, people who have faced unimaginable pain. The ones who heal most fully are not the emotionally numb. They are the ones who allow themselves to feel, to grieve, to move through emotion instead of running from it. Sensitivity allows integration. And integration is resilience. Another myth is that crying in public or at work will make people lose respect for you. I trained in hospital environments where life and death decisions were routine, and I saw exceptional doctors, nurses, and surgeons cry, not performatively, not dramatically, humanly. Those moments did not reduce their credibility. They increased trust, because authenticity creates safety. People trust emotional honesty far more than emotional armor. The final myth is that you should be able to control when and where you cry. This belief creates constant tension. You spend your day bracing yourself, afraid that emotion will leak. And that hyper-control actually intensifies emotional release when it finally happens. Emotions have their own timing. Trying to dominate them completely is like trying to control hunger or sleep. What you can learn is not suppression, but navigation. Understanding this changes how you relate to yourself. Because crying is not the problem. Shame is. And once shame is removed, sensitivity becomes something very different. It becomes information, guidance, intelligence. Attraction usually doesn't change in loud moments. It changes quietly, inside the nervous system. Most people believe interest grows when things move forward. Psychologically, it grows when the body no longer feels the need to protect itself. A woman's brain is constantly scanning for safety, not consciously, but biologically. Tone of voice, pacing, distance, emotional pressure, all of it is being processed before logic even steps in. When she allows physical closeness without tension, without stiffening her posture, without pulling back even slightly, that tells us something important has already happened internally. Her limbic system, the emotional center of the brain, has relaxed. And a relaxed limbic system only appears when she doesn't feel evaluated. She doesn't feel rushed. She doesn't feel she has to perform. This is where many misunderstand attraction. They think permission means readiness for more. In reality, permission means trust, not escalation. The moment pressure enters, even subtle pressure, cortisol rises. Cortisol is the hormone that shuts desire down quietly, without drama. That's why women don't always lose interest suddenly. They simply close internally when the body feels pushed ahead of its emotional timing. A woman's body responds before her words ever do, before she explains, before she defines, before she admits anything to herself. If she allows you inside her physical comfort zone, calmly, naturally, without subconscious resistance, then emotionally, she is already connected, not because something was taken, but because something felt safe enough to be allowed. This is the stage where patience matters more than action. Because attraction doesn't disappear loudly. It disappears the moment safety is replaced with urgency. When safety is replaced with urgency, the body doesn't argue. It simply protects itself. This is why, right after this stage, many women appear to pull back. Not because attraction disappeared, but because the nervous system is recalibrating. Psychologically, this is a checking phase. Her mind is asking one quiet question. Was that safety real, or was it temporary? At this point, she becomes more observant. She watches how you respond to distance, how you handle silence, whether your behavior stays steady or becomes restless. This is where impatience creates the biggest damage. If urgency shows up, more pressure, more reassurance seeking, more attempts to define, the brain interprets it as emotional instability. And emotional instability feels unsafe, even when intentions are good. What most people misunderstand is this: pulling back is not rejection, it is regulation. The nervous system needs space to confirm that closeness won't come with cost. If the pace remains calm, consistent, and unchanged, attraction doesn't weaken. It settles deeper. But if the response to her distance is pursuit driven by fear, the body remembers that feeling, and the door closes quietly. Connection grows when emotional rhythm is respected, not matched aggressively, not forced forward, simply allowed to breathe. This stage decides everything, because once the body learns that closeness does not lead to pressure, it no longer needs to protect itself. And when protection turns off, attachment forms naturally, without effort, without strategy, without control. That's how real emotional bonding begins. Once the nervous system learns that closeness does not lead to pressure, something subtle but powerful begins to change. The need to stay guarded slowly fades. This is the phase where emotional attachment stops being reactive and starts becoming intentional. Not in words, but in behavior. Her responses become less calculated. Her presence feels less monitored. There is a noticeable softness in how she engages, not because she is trying to impress, but because her body no longer feels the need to stay alert. Psychologically, this happens when the brain shifts from threat monitoring to bond maintenance. At this point, attraction is no longer driven by excitement alone. It is supported by emotional predictability. What most people fail to understand is that emotional predictability is deeply attractive to the female nervous system. Not boredom, not routine, but consistency without demand. When a man remains emotionally stable, neither withdrawing to regain control nor advancing to secure reassurance, the brain registers him as safe long-term presence. This is where attachment hormones like oxytocin quietly increase, not dramatically, not romantically exaggerated, but steadily. Oxytocin doesn't respond to words. It responds to how regulated another person feels. If your emotional energy remains the same, whether she leans in or steps back, the bond strengthens. Because the body senses reliability. This is also the stage where many men unintentionally sabotage everything. They mistake comfort for certainty. They begin assuming instead of observing. They relax their emotional awareness. They stop reading the rhythm. And when awareness drops, subtle missteps appear. Tone shifts. Entitlement. Expectations. Nothing obvious. Just enough for the nervous system to notice change. Attraction doesn't collapse here. It hesitates. Because the body is asking, again, is this still safe or is it changing? This is why emotional maturity matters more at this stage than chemistry ever did earlier. Real connection is maintained through attunement, the ability to stay emotionally present without controlling the outcome. When a woman feels that she can move freely, closer or farther without consequences, attachment deepens naturally. There is no rush, no performance, no emotional bargaining, just a quiet sense of ease. And ease is not passive, it is earned. This phase doesn't look dramatic from the outside, but internally, it is decisive. Because once the nervous system associates a person with calm, stability, and emotional safety, detachment becomes difficult. Not because of dependency, but because the body recognizes regulation, and the body always prefers what helps it feel balanced. This is how interest transforms into emotional bonding, not through intensity, but through steadiness. When steadiness becomes familiar, the nervous system stops asking questions. This is the stage where bonding is no longer forming, it is established. At this point, emotional connection is not maintained through effort. It is maintained through absence of threat. Her body no longer scans for inconsistency. Her mind no longer anticipates sudden shifts. The connection feels stable enough that attention moves away from analysis and into experience. Psychologically, this is when attachment integrates into identity. She doesn't think in terms of liking or not liking anymore. The bond exists quietly in the background, influencing choices, preferences, and emotional orientation. This is also where many misunderstand what commitment actually feels like. It doesn't arrive as excitement. It arrives as ease. Ease in silence. Ease in proximity. Ease in not having to explain emotional states. The nervous system recognizes this person as part of its regulation loop, someone whose presence does not create imbalance. That is why attempts to rush definitions at this stage often feel unnecessary or even disruptive. The bond has already answered the question internally. What matters now is preservation. Attachment remains secure when emotional behavior stays congruent. Not perfect, not performative, simply aligned. Small inconsistencies are noticed more here, not because attraction is fragile, but because safety has become the standard. Anything that disrupts it feels louder. This is why emotional withdrawal, sudden control, or subtle power shifts are particularly damaging at this stage. They don't hurt because of loss, they hurt because they violate expectation. The nervous system had already relaxed. And once relaxed, it does not tolerate instability easily. When the emotional environment remains calm, responsive, and non-demanding, bonding deepens into loyalty. Not forced loyalty, biological loyalty. The body begins to favor this connection automatically. Distance feels unfamiliar. Disruption feels uncomfortable, not out of fear, but out of contrast. This is where real attachment differs from infatuation. Infatuation craves stimulation. Attachment prefers regulation. And regulation always wins long term. This stage does not need strategies. It does not respond to manipulation. It only survives through authenticity and emotional responsibility. When someone remains emotionally grounded, consistent in tone, behavior, and intention, the bond stabilizes without negotiation. That is the quiet truth of connection. Not intensity, not persuasion, not control, just a nervous system that no longer needs to protect itself. And once protection turns into preference, attachment becomes natural and difficult to replace. That is how emotional bonding completes its cycle.